They whispered that a princess had been seen not in the glittering halls of royalty, but among the small tables of a smoky cafe in Paris, her gown cut daringly low, her laughter ringing in defiance, while all around her murmured in shock. In that moment, Clara Ward, born in faraway Detroit, once wife to a Belgian prince, chose her own stage. She was no longer the obedient jewel of high society, but a woman who dared to live by her own pulse, scandalous and unrepentant. Before we begin, my friend, allow me to greet you gently. I am glad you are here. Tell me, if you wish, in the quiet of the comments, from where and when you listen to these words. Together we form a long and silent circle across the world, holding stories as if they were embers. And if these embers warm you, let your hand press that small button of subscription, so that our circle may continue to grow, joined by others who love to drift upon the currents of memory. Let us turn now, slowly and with care, to the beginning of Clara Ward's life, to a time when her name was not yet whispered with scandal, but sung with hope and expectation across the snow-laden streets of Detroit. Detroit in the year 1873 was not yet the restless heart of the automobile age. Instead, it was a place of riverboats and lumber wealth, where fortunes rose from timber, iron, and trade, and where the scent of pine mixed with coal smoke upon the sharp air of the Great Lakes. It was into this world on a November day that Clara was born, daughter of Captain Brock Ward, one of the richest men in the American Midwest, and his young wife, Catherine Lyon. Her father's empire stretched across ships, furnaces, and factories. His name carried weight like steel. To his newborn daughter, he gave not only a family, but a fortune that would ripple across her destiny like an unseen current. One can imagine the household into which she was received. The heavy drapes muffling the windows, the sound of servants moving briskly through corridors, the sharp clip of boots across polished wood. Clara, a fragile infant wrapped in white cloth, would have known nothing of it then, yet the air of expectation must have hung over her cradle like an invisible crown. She was not merely a child. She was an heiress, and though she had no title, no rank of nobility, in America wealth could mimic all of those things. But fortune's gifts are often laid alongside its curses. When Clara was still only a girl, she felt the blow of loss. Her father, so mighty in business, was taken suddenly, leaving behind an immense estate and children too young to understand the weight of their inheritance. In that moment, her life shifted. She was the child of wealth, yes, but also of vulnerability. Without a father's hand to steady her course, she would be steered by others, by guardians, by suitors, and by the restless hunger of her own heart. As she grew, the city of Detroit changed around her. The winters pressed hard with wind off the river, filling the nights with the low sound of ice breaking on the water. The summers were heavy with green, the trees thick and buzzing with cicadas. Clara was taught to walk gracefully, to read the classics, to play piano with fingers light upon the keys. One may picture her at 14 or 15, sitting in a parlor where the gaslight flickered and the scent of roses lingered in the heat, her hair pinned carefully, her eyes drifting to the window beyond the lace curtains. Already, perhaps, she wondered what lay beyond the garden wall, what paths of freedom stretched past the careful fences of propriety. The newspapers in those days often wrote of the daughters of wealthy men as if they were jewels to be placed upon the crowns of distant kingdoms. Clara was such a jewel. She was said to have a beauty that carried a hint of unruliness, a spark in her gaze that suggested she might not be easily contained. What must it have felt like, to be so young and yet to sense that the world was already watching, waiting, whispering? To be told that her fate was not hers to hold, but something to be bartered, arranged, and displayed. In the slow passing of days, she would have moved between lessons and gatherings, between quiet dinners and the more elaborate entertainments of Detroit society. Each moment polished her into the image of a lady, yet each also layered upon her the subtle weight of expectation. A girl with so much fortune was not free to dream like other children. She was meant for alliances, for display, for marriages that carried not love but prestige. Did she sense it then? Did she feel, even as a child, the invisible chains that wealth and beauty laid upon her wrists? The memory of her father lingered in the halls. Some said he was a man of steel, hard and ambitious, while others remembered the warmth he could show within the family circle. Clara would have been too young to know him well, and yet in the absence of his presence, his shadow must have grown even larger. Perhaps she dreamed of him, imagined what he might have said to her as she grew, wondered whether he would have guarded her from the storms that awaited. Or perhaps, with the recklessness of youth, she felt nothing of this, and only longed for the world that stretched beyond Detroit's slow horizons. By the time she reached her late teens, Clara was already a figure of fascination, not merely because of her fortune, but because of her presence. It is said that when she entered a room, people noticed not only her appearance, but the way she carried herself, as if she had some inner music that moved her more freely than others. Some called it grace, others boldness. To her family, it may have been a cause for worry. A girl so visible, so wealthy, so watched by society, could not afford to stumble, and yet stumble she would, or so the world believed. But in truth, what is stumbling? When a woman chooses to walk a path different from the one laid out for her, is that a fall or is it flight? Already in her youth, the question was written into her life. Clara was not meant to remain in Detroit. Her fortune would carry her across the ocean, into the arms of royalty, and then in time into scandal and infamy. But let us linger here a little longer in the air of her childhood, where snow gathers upon window ledges, and a girl with restless eyes sits at a piano, her fingers tracing a tune, both learned and improvised. There is still innocence in the sound, but beneath it one can almost hear another rhythm, faint and growing, like footsteps upon a distant shore. It is the rhythm of change, of departure, of a life that would not be confined. The bell of a nearby church tolls the hour, slow and resonant, filling the night with its solemn call. The note hangs, then fades. For Clara, each toll was a step toward the world awaiting beyond. The bell that tolled through the wintry air of Detroit did not end with silence. Its echo stretched, softened, and shifted into something brighter, as though one sound were passing into another. What had begun as the solemn voice of a church bell seemed to change, in memory's slow weaving, into the lighter chime of a wedding bell. And so the next stage of Clara Ward's story begins, not with mourning or childhood innocence, but with the anticipation of adolescence, and with the shadow of vows that would, in time, be spoken before all the eyes of Europe. Adolescence is a fragile hour of life, when the body and spirit seem restless, too large for their confines, too small for the expectations already placed upon them. Clara, daughter of fortune, must have felt this restlessness acutely. As she grew tall and graceful, as her features sharpened and her hair caught the light, the city around her whispered her name more frequently. Suitors, guardians, and society matrons watched her as one might watch the ripening of fruit upon a heavily laden tree. She was both admired and measured, weighed in advance against the possibilities of her future. Detroit, in the late 1880s, was not a city of marble palaces or royal courts, yet within its finest houses there was a keen sense of hierarchy and ambition. Clara's family, wealthy beyond most imagination, ensured that she was educated with refinement. Piano scales filled her mornings. Embroidery, French conversation, and readings of poetry shaped her afternoons. The family's drawing room, warmed by gas lamps and hung with heavy draperies, would have echoed with the practiced courtesies of visitors. Each visit, each carefully arranged conversation, was part of a preparation, the shaping of Clara into a woman ready to be displayed and married. And yet, What must it have felt like for her, inside the solitude of her own thoughts? A young woman with wealth may seem powerful, yet often she is most imprisoned. The knowledge that she was watched for alliances rather than for herself, that her face was valued for beauty, her fortune for advantage, must have left her with an undercurrent of unease. Did she long for simple freedoms, such as walking unobserved in a crowded street, or laughing without consequence at a jest not meant for polite company? Did she ever wonder whether all the polished lessons, all the drilled courtesies, were meant to silence the truer voice within her? The wedding bell that echoed faintly in her imagination was not yet real, but the conversations around her made it feel inevitable. Distant cousins, society friends, all spoke of the future as though it were already mapped. She was destined, they said, for a grand marriage. Some whispered of American magnates who might seek her hand, uniting fortune with fortune. Others imagined European aristocrats, impoverished in lands but rich in titles, eager for the golden river of American wealth to flow into their estates. Each speculation placed Clara not as a subject, but as an object, the prize to be claimed. The paradox of her life in these years lies in the contrast between the luxury she enjoyed and the invisible cage it represented. She had silks for her dresses, jewels for her neck, fine books upon her shelves, and carriages to carry her wherever she wished. And yet the true choices, where to live, whom to love, how to be, were never hers alone. They were choices others would negotiate in the quiet of parlors and over the clink of glasses. It is said that young Clara often showed a spark of mischief in her expression, as though she were never quite satisfied with the mask of politeness. This spark may have frightened those around her, for it hinted that she might not submit easily to the role of ornament and dutiful wife. That spark, carried with her into adulthood, would later blaze into defiance. But for now it smoldered, hidden behind fans and bows, behind the careful training of etiquette masters. Her mother, Catherine, must have struggled to balance protection with display. To guard Clara from ill-suited suitors was one task. To position her advantageously was another. Mothers of heiresses carried an invisible burden, to marry their daughters well, to ensure that fortune translated into status, to secure a place in the hierarchy of both America and, perhaps, Europe. Catherine could not have known that her daughter would not only marry into European nobility, but also later shock that same world by tearing herself free from its chains. In these adolescent years, Clara's restlessness grew. The bells of Detroit churches marked time too slowly for her, the streets too familiar, the society balls too predictable. She must have dreamed of other places, Paris with its boulevards, Vienna with its music, London with its grandeur. The photographs of palaces and gardens in illustrated papers may have felt like doorways waiting to be opened. For a girl of wealth and beauty, the ocean was not a barrier, but a promise. And in time, that promise would call her forth. But before departure, there is always a long moment of waiting, of anticipation. The years of adolescence can feel like an endless preparation for a role not yet begun. Clara stood before her mirror in silk gowns, her hair carefully arranged, her smile rehearsed. Each evening out was a rehearsal. Each suitor's glance was a test. Each whisper in society's ear was a measure of her worth. And within her, a question grew quietly. Was she being prepared for glory or for a kind of gentle captivity? When she sat at the piano in those days, the notes must have carried a mix of obedience and rebellion. The sonatas of Beethoven or Chopin required discipline, but perhaps her fingers lingered, improvising small patterns that spoke her own mind. In those improvised notes, no one else could dictate her rhythm. For a few brief moments, she was neither heiress nor ornament, but simply a girl with music inside her. As the seasons passed, Clara matured into a young woman of striking presence. The fortune she inherited glowed around her like an aura, but so too did something less tangible, a a vitality, a refusal to be only what others demanded. To some, this made her fascinating. To others, it made her dangerous. Yet all agreed she was destined for something beyond Detroit. The city could no longer contain her. And so the wedding bell that had rung faintly in imagination grew louder, clearer. The time was approaching when she would leave America, when her fortune and her beauty would be offered upon the altar of a European match. Already her name was whispered not only in Detroit parlors, but across the Atlantic. Already princes and counts, burdened with debts yet proud of their bloodlines, looked toward America's wealthy daughters as salvation. Clara's path was not yet set, but the door was opening. The bell that had once tolled solemnly over her childhood had now become a chime of anticipation, lighter yet no less insistent. The sound seemed to follow her through the streets, through the gaslit evenings, through the drawing rooms where suitors bowed and mothers whispered. It was the sound of destiny approaching, of vows soon to be spoken, though whether with joy or with resignation, none could yet know. The echo of the wedding bell lingers still, fading not into silence but into the image of a steamship at harbor, its whistle low and insistent, ready to carry her across the Atlantic. The sound of the wedding bell seemed to stretch outward until it merged with another, a deeper and more resonant call, the long, low whistle of a steamship preparing to depart. Its cry rolled across the harbor, carrying over water darkened by smoke and mist, a summons not to ceremony but to journey. For Clara Ward, the steamship was no mere vessel of iron and timber. It was a threshold. When she stepped aboard, leaving behind the familiar shores of America, she was stepping into the unknown theater of Europe, where her fortune and beauty would open doors gilded with both wonder and peril. It is easy to imagine the scene. The year is the early 1890s. Detroit lies behind her, the Great Lakes already a memory. Before her rises the towering hull of the ocean liner, black against a sky streaked with gulls. The air smells of salt, coal, and anticipation. Around her, other travelers bustle, their trunks stacked high, their cloaks pulled tight against the wind. Yet for Clara there is no nervousness, only an irresistible sense that this was the path she was always meant to walk. A city like Detroit could nurture her beginnings, but her destiny, so all had whispered, lay across the Atlantic, in salons where chandeliers trembled with laughter, in ballrooms where princes sought heiresses to mend their fortunes. When the ship began to move, her gaze must have lingered upon the receding shoreline. Perhaps she thought of her father, the stern captain whose empire of steel and shipping had given her this chance, though he had not lived to see it. Perhaps she thought of her mother, who watched anxiously as her daughter was offered to the great stage of Europe. Or perhaps Clara thought only of herself and of the freedom of distance, the knowledge that once the ship passed beyond the horizon, she would be no longer the watched daughter of Detroit society, but something else. Something not yet defined. The voyage itself, days of endless sea, may have been both confinement and revelation. The vastness of the ocean, stretching in all directions without end, reflected something within Clara. The sense of life unbounded, the refusal to remain contained by the neat boxes drawn for her by others. She walked the decks where the wind cut through her shawl, feeling the salt sting her cheeks, and perhaps she thought, "This is freedom. This is what it feels like to belong to no one but the horizon." And yet, freedom is never simple. She was surrounded by fellow travelers, wealthy men titled ladies, merchants, and fortune seekers who eyed her with curiosity. Already her reputation preceded her, the American heiress who would surely marry a man of name. Already she was discussed, measured, speculated upon, as if her life were a wager placed upon the waves. When the ship finally drew into port, whether at Le Havre or Antwerp, the world awaiting her was dazzling and strange. Clara, stepping onto European soil, carried within her not only her fortune but her Americanness, something both admired and mocked in the salons of the Old World. To the impoverished nobility of Europe, American heiresses were lifelines, their wealth a means to restore faded estates. Yet they were also regarded as outsiders, with manners too bold, laughter too free, opinions too direct. Clara would embody both qualities, her wealth irresistible, her spirit impossible to suppress. Her first glimpses of European grandeur must have overwhelmed even her restless soul. Streets lined with centuries-old buildings, palaces rising with towers and gilded gates, carriages rattling on cobblestones where monarchs had once passed. The salons into which she was introduced shimmered with candlelight reflected in crystal, with music flowing from violins, with conversations that danced in French, German, and Italian. The air smelled of perfume, wax, and anticipation, as though each evening were a performance upon a stage older than her nation itself. For Clara, this was both enchanting and suffocating. Enchanting, because she had been raised to long for such display. Suffocating, because beneath the gold and music there was the same cage she had known at home, only now wrought with finer bars. To be the heiress in these circles was to be observed constantly. Every movement was read as a signal. Every glance was interpreted as an invitation or refusal. The weight of expectation followed her across the ocean, as heavy in Brussels or Paris as it had been in Detroit. Among the salons of Brussels, Clara encountered the family of Caraman-Chimay, Belgian nobility whose name carried centuries of history. The prince, Joseph de Caraman-Chimay, was older, dignified, and burdened with the responsibilities of lineage. To his family, Clara's fortune shone like salvation. To Clara, he may have seemed at first like the embodiment of European glamour, the doorway into a life of title and recognition. Their marriage, when it came, would transform her overnight into Princess de Chimay, giving her what few American girls could claim, a name among the nobility of Europe. Yet one wonders, even in those early introductions, whether Clara felt the stirrings of restlessness. Did she see in Joseph a partner or a custodian? Did she feel love or only the weight of inevitability? The salons whispered of her beauty, her gowns, her daring manner of speaking. Some admired her as a fresh breeze among the stiff rituals of Europe's aristocracy. Others regarded her with suspicion, predicting that her American boldness would unsettle more than it soothed. Already, perhaps, Clara sensed that she was both welcomed and excluded, desired for her fortune and judged for her difference. In that paradox lay the seeds of the scandals to come. Evenings stretched long in those first years abroad. Music filled the grand rooms. Dancers glided beneath gilded ceilings. Courtiers exchanged subtle words behind fans and glasses of champagne. Clara, moving among them, played her role with grace, but within her grew the awareness that she was being molded into something ornamental, an ornament she was not meant to be. The ocean that had carried her here still sang in her blood, the memory of vast waters without fences, of horizons that belonged to no one. Perhaps it was in the quiet hours after the gatherings ended, when the rooms were empty and the candles extinguished, that she most clearly felt the tension of her life. Alone in her chamber, the perfume of roses still clinging to her gown, she must have asked herself, is this all? To be admired, to be titled, to be contained? Or was there another life waiting, one she would have to seize with her own hands, regardless of scandal? The whistle of the steamship, now only a memory, still lingered within her. It was a sound of departure, of freedom, of the possibility of escape. For though Clara had arrived in Europe to fulfill the destiny others had written, her own destiny, fierce and unruly, had only just begun to stir. The door of a salon opens, velvet drapes part, and Clara steps into the light of a ballroom, where chandeliers shimmer above and eyes follow her every move. The ballroom, with its velvet drapes and glittering chandeliers, held Clara Ward in its bright embrace, but even the shimmer of crystal and the rustle of gowns could not disguise the deeper truth that lingered behind the curtains. The light of that ballroom blurred into another chamber altogether, quieter, more solemn, where the echo of music gave way to the echo of vows. What had been the stage of her introduction soon became the chapel of her marriage, a place where fortune and lineage were joined not in love but in arrangement, as so many unions of that age were. The marriage of Clara Ward to Prince Joseph de Caraman-Chimay was spoken of across Europe, an American heiress of immense fortune, becoming the bride of Belgian nobility whose family name stretched deep into the annals of history. In that instant, Clara was transformed from daughter of Detroit into Princess de Chimay, given a title that even her great fortune could never have purchased alone. To many, it was the perfect match, the blending of new wealth and old nobility, the solution to debts on one side and the yearning for prestige on the other. Yet the perfection was an illusion, as fragile as the lace that veiled her face. One can imagine the chapel where the vows were spoken. Candles lined the altar, their flames steady against the still air. The scent of wax mingled with incense, and above them painted saints gazed down in silence. Clara stood in silk, her gown heavy, her veil thin enough to let the light fall softly across her features. The words of the priest, solemn and rhythmic, filled the chamber like a tide. Around her, guests watched closely, their eyes reflecting admiration, envy, and curiosity. Did they see joy upon her face, or only obedience? Did they hear love in the vows, or only the unspoken calculation of wealth and title? Joseph, her husband, was a man of standing, but also of reserve. He carried the dignity of his family, the formality of his class, and the quiet burden of maintaining a noble house in an age where nobility often meant debt and difficulty. Clara, bright with youth, might have seemed like salvation. To him, she brought wealth enough to secure estates, to restore grandeur, to keep the house of Caraman-Chimay alive in a new century. To her, he gave not wealth, for she already had it, but rank, the shimmering glamour of being called princess, the right to walk into courts and salons where money alone could not gain admittance. The vows echoed through the chamber, and in their sound one can sense both triumph and loss. Triumph, for Clara was raised higher than any of her American peers might have imagined. Loss, for in that same vow she was bound more tightly than ever before. For a woman who carried within her a restless spirit, marriage to a prince was not liberation, but confinement, gilded with ceremony. The reception afterward would have been lavish, filled with music, with congratulations, with champagne glasses lifted and emptied. Gowns glittered, uniforms gleamed, and the air was filled with laughter and speculation. The American press reported the union as proof that Europe still longed for American fortunes, and Europe whispered that Clara, though bold, was beautiful enough to charm even the proudest house. Yet beneath the glitter, beneath the smiles, one might imagine Clara herself looking out across the guests, her eyes wandering not with pride, but with a subtle yearning. For in that hour of triumph, she may already have felt the first shadow of restlessness. Marriage brought her into the halls of Chimay, into the stately routines of nobility. The days unfolded with predictability, dinners with dignitaries, visits to salons, evenings of polite entertainment. The household ran with the quiet hum of servants, the measured tick of clocks, the polished manners of aristocracy. And within this carefully constructed order, Clara found herself restless. She was not born to submission. She was not content to be a silent ornament, admired and contained. Even as she played the role of princess, her spirit strained against the invisible walls. It is said that her beauty only grew more radiant in these years, her presence captivating not only the eyes, but the imagination of those around her. Yet with beauty came whispers. Her manner was too free, her laughter too bold, her eyes too alive with mischief for the liking of conservative society. Some were charmed, others were wary, but all agreed she was not like the other princesses. Clara was an American, and Americans, it was said, carried something untamed in their blood. The contradiction of her marriage lay in this. She had gained everything society told her she should want, and yet she felt the emptiness of it. Titles and wealth, gowns and jewels, mansions and recognition, all these things could not quiet the deeper hunger within her. What she longed for was not another estate or another jeweled necklace, but freedom, the freedom to follow her heart, to live without constant watch, to breathe without constant expectation. When she walked through the halls of her new home, one imagines the sound of her footsteps echoing at night, a rhythm restless and unsettled. Perhaps she paused at windows overlooking gardens, where moonlight silvered the stone paths, and wondered whether she had traded one prison for another. Her childhood in Detroit had been gilded with wealth, but bounded by duty. Now, as Princess de Chimay, she had exchanged one gilded cage for another, more resplendent, yet no less confining. The vows spoken in that chapel bound her in ways unseen. They gave her a title, but they also placed upon her the expectations of a lineage centuries old. A princess was meant to be composed, obedient, a vessel of dignity. Clara was none of these things for long. Her beauty might win her admiration, but her restlessness would lead her toward choices that society would not forgive. Still, in these early years, before the scandals began, there must have been moments of quiet, of gentleness when Clara and Joseph lived as husband and wife without the weight of society pressing too heavily. Perhaps in those moments she felt a kind of peace, the possibility that she might adapt, that her spirit might soften within the steady order of noble life. But such moments were brief, fleeting like candle flames in the wind. The echo of her vows remained, not only in memory but in the shape of her days. They whispered of duty, of loyalty, of permanence. And yet, within her heart, another voice grew louder, a voice that called her away from the confines of marriage, away from the heavy halls, toward something less certain but more alive. The echo of vows spoken without warmth fades, leaving behind the sound of footsteps pacing at night, restless and unresolved. The sound of footsteps at night carries with it an unease that the day cannot disguise. They echo through corridors dimly lit, a rhythm too restless for sleep, a confession without words. In the halls of Chimay, where silence pressed heavily upon carved wood and stone, Clara Ward's steps betrayed the tension of her soul. She had spoken her vows, she had taken her title, and yet within the quiet of midnight her spirit roamed, unable to rest in the ordered life of a princess. Her new home, the Château de Chimay, was a place of history and dignity, its walls hung with portraits of ancestors who stared with solemn eyes, guardians of tradition. The gardens, manicured and precise, were designed to soothe the mind with symmetry. Yet to Clara, the order of these surroundings may have felt more like constraint than comfort. Each window looked out onto beauty, but it was beauty arranged, controlled, and silent. A bird in a gilded cage may sing, but the bars still press against its wings. During the day, her life unfolded according to the rhythm of nobility. There were visits from dignitaries, receptions with music and dance, excursions to other estates where rituals of conversation were observed with precision. She smiled, curtsied, and laughed when laughter was expected. She wore gowns of silk embroidered with gold, jewels that glimmered in the light of chandeliers, and gloves that softened her touch. And all the while, beneath the veneer of elegance, there stirred a spirit that could not be stilled. Clara's beauty drew admiration, but her restlessness drew suspicion. She was too vivid, too alive, too unwilling to be merely a silent partner in another family's legacy. The whispers began almost as soon as she settled into her role as Princess de Chimay. Guests noticed her way of speaking, more direct than European women were trained to be. They remarked on her laughter, which did not always remain within the boundaries of polite amusement. They saw her boldness in fashion, the way her gown slipped lower at the shoulders than custom approved, the way she wore her presence like a challenge. To some, she was refreshing. To others, she was alarming. Yet all agreed. Clara Ward was not a woman easily subdued. The restlessness that carried her through sleepless nights may have been born from many sources. Perhaps it was the inheritance of her father, a man of industry and enterprise who thrived not by standing still, but by seizing opportunities. Perhaps it was the spirit of her homeland, America, where newness and freedom were spoken of as birthrights. Or perhaps it was simply the essence of Clara herself, an energy that resisted confinement, a hunger that no title or fortune could satisfy. Her husband, Prince Joseph, must have noticed the unease. He was a man of dignity, of duty, bound by the traditions of his family. To him, the role of a wife was clear. She was to embody grace, obedience, and discretion. Clara embodied beauty and charm, yes, but not the quiet submission expected of her station. Their union, arranged upon the balance of wealth and nobility, was already shadowed by an incompatibility of spirits. Where he sought order, she sought freedom. Where he prized stability, she longed for change. The tension of their difference could be heard in the silence of their halls, could be seen in the way her footsteps wandered at night. Yet even as dissatisfaction grew, Clara was admired beyond measure. She became a figure of fascination in Brussels and Paris, her name spoken in salons where society gathered to gossip. They praised her beauty, described her gowns in detail, speculated about her future. But beneath the admiration lay a current of doubt. Could such a woman, so spirited, so unwilling to yield, ever remain content as a princess? The question was whispered in corners, asked in letters, murmured behind fans. Few suspected that in time Clara herself would answer it, not with words, but with choices that shocked all of Europe. For now, the scandals had not yet erupted. There were only small rebellions, subtle and quiet. A gown worn too daringly low at the neckline, a remark made too freely at a gathering, a glance held too long with a stranger across the room. Each of these acts was small in itself, yet together they wove a pattern, a suggestion that Clara's heart was restless, her loyalty uncertain, her destiny not aligned with the path laid before her. And so she paced at night, the echo of her steps filling the halls. Perhaps she paused before the great portraits of Chime ancestors, their faces stern and unyielding, their eyes seeming to judge her. Did she feel their disapproval, or did she smile at their severity, amused at how little their painted glances could truly contain her? Perhaps she stood at windows overlooking the dark gardens, breathing in the cool night air, imagining another life beyond the hedges and walls. The sound of her footsteps was not only a rhythm of unrest, but a quiet rehearsal for escape. In these restless nights, Clara may have asked herself whether love had ever been present in her marriage. Did she ever feel true affection for Joseph, or only the weight of duty? Did he see her as a partner, or only as the fortune that secured his family's place? Such questions must have haunted her, for Clara was not a woman who could silence her own heart. To live without love, to live only as ornament and possession, was for her a kind of death. And so her footsteps carried her not only through corridors, but toward the threshold of choices that would transform her life. The whispers in salons grew louder, though still vague. They spoke of a princess too bold, too daring. They spoke of a woman whose spirit did not fit within the role given her. They spoke, with both admiration and unease, of a beauty too restless to remain contained. Clara heard these whispers, and perhaps they only fueled her determination. If she was to be judged, then let her be judged for living as she wished, not as others dictated. The sound of her footsteps continued, night after night, until the rhythm itself became like a drumbeat leading towards something yet unseen. The silence of the chateau pressed upon her, but it could not silence her spirit. And soon the steps that echoed in private halls would carry her outward into the streets of Paris, where gaslight flickered and freedom whispered from behind closed doors. The pacing of midnight gives way to the flicker of gaslight in fog, a restless flame waiting to guide her into scandal. The flicker of gaslight upon a foggy street is unlike any other glow, neither steady nor secure. It sways and shimmers, bending with the night air, making the world appear uncertain, half real. It was under such lights in Paris that Clara Ward's footsteps began to wander beyond the measured corridors of Chimay, carrying her into a realm where whispers were louder than prayers and curiosity sharper than courtesy. The restless steps she had taken through the chateau at night now echoed upon cobblestones, mingling with the laughter of strangers and the faint clatter of carriages rolling through narrow lanes. Paris was a world of light and shadow, a city of salons and streets, where beauty was both celebrated and consumed. Clara, already admired for her boldness, found in this place a stage more fitting than the quiet halls of her Belgian household. The city offered her a freedom she could not taste elsewhere, for in Paris even scandal had its admirers, and even defiance could be disguised as art. The gaslights along the boulevards lit not only the streets, but the eyes of those who longed to see and be seen. It was here that Clara began to experiment, not only with her time and her company, but with her very appearance. Fashion became her language, and through it she spoke of her refusal to be bound. While noblewomen of her rank dressed in layers that concealed as much as they revealed, Clara dared to expose shoulders, to lower the line of her gown, to shorten a hem so that the curve of an ankle might shock the careful eyes of society. The silk she wore clung too closely, the jewels she chose sparkled too brightly, the hats she adorned herself with tilted at too daring an angle. Each garment was more than cloth, it was declaration, each appearance in public a performance. The salons of Paris, glittering with chandeliers and perfumed with roses and tobacco, became places where Clara's name was on every tongue. Admirers spoke of her beauty with awe, rivals spoke of her brazenness with disdain, and yet both could not look away. She was a princess, yes, but one who laughed more freely than was deemed proper, who allowed her gaze to meet a man's eyes too directly, who seemed to court attention not by accident, but by intention. Some claim she was only naive, an American untrained in the subtleties of European restraint. Others suspected something deeper, a deliberate refusal to bow, a conscious rebellion dressed in satin and lace. Newspapers, always hungry for stories of scandal, began to notice her too. They described her gowns in detail, lingered on her boldness, and hinted at improprieties without naming them. Clara was becoming not merely a princess, but a figure of fascination, her image drifting far beyond the salons into the imaginations of strangers. The very wealth that had made her desirable as a bride now fueled her notoriety, for it allowed her to indulge whims, to commission daring dresses, to travel, to live as one untethered. Her husband, Prince Joseph, must have watched with unease as his wife drew such attention. For him, dignity was paramount, and discretion the lifeblood of nobility. Clara's presence in Paris, her fashion choices, her laughter, her willingness to be observed, cut against every expectation he had of a wife. Perhaps he tried to restrain her, to guide her into the quiet dignity of noble life. But Clara, once placed before the mirror of society, could not be drawn back into shadow. She had tasted the thrill of being not merely admired but discussed, and it suited her restless heart more than silence ever could. And yet beneath the fascination lay the first tremors of scandal. For every admirer who praised her courage, there was another who whispered that such behavior could only lead to disgrace. Clara was watched with sharper eyes now, not only as a beauty but as a potential transgressor, one whose fall might entertain as much as her presence already did. In Paris, a city that celebrated freedom, there was still no mercy for women who pushed too far beyond expectation. The flicker of gaslight upon fog mirrored Clara's own position. To some, she glowed with allure. To others, she was obscured by impropriety. She lived in the uncertain space between admiration and condemnation, balancing upon it with a daring grace. Each night she stepped into that half-light, she seemed to invite the world to look upon her and judge, yet she cared little for the verdict. For her, the act of being seen, the act of choosing how she would appear, was itself the victory. Those who watched her closely noticed not only her gowns, but the subtle gestures of her defiance, the way she lingered in conversation with men beyond what was polite, the way she turned her head with a smile that suggested secrets, the way she occupied space without apology. In the rigid codes of her time, these were small rebellions, but their meaning was vast. They declared that Clara Ward was not a possession, not a fortune to be displayed, but a woman whose presence was her own. The nights in Paris carried music, laughter, and the sharp edge of whispers. Clara's figure, luminous beneath gaslight, became a symbol of both fascination and fear. For those bound tightly by convention, she represented danger, the danger that beauty and wealth might choose to live freely rather than obediently. For others, she represented possibility, the possibility that even within the narrow cages of nobility, one might step beyond the bars and breathe. And yet the flickering flame of gaslight never burns steadily. It wavers, it threatens to extinguish, it casts shadows as much as it gives light. Clara's choices, bold though they were, carried consequences she could not yet see. The whispers would grow louder, the disapproval sharper until her restless steps would no longer be confined to salons and fashionable streets. They would carry her further, into the arms of passion, into the embrace of scandal, into the very heart of notoriety. For now, though, Paris was her stage, and she played upon it with reckless grace. The city watched, the salons murmured, the newspapers speculated. And Clara, with eyes bright beneath her daring hat, with silk clinging to her form, walked unafraid into the glow of gaslight, as though it were her birthright. The flickering flame bends once more, and in its shifting glow appear the eyes of a stranger, a violinist whose gaze will alter the course of her life. From the shifting flame of gaslight, a new image emerged, as though the city itself conspired to reveal it. Out of the wavering shadows of Paris appeared the eyes of a stranger, dark and searching, the kind of gaze that does not merely look but lingers, that asks questions without words. This gaze belonged to János Rigó, a Hungarian violinist whose presence was far from the stately order of noble salons. He was of the world of music, of passion, of traveling souls who belonged to no one place but carried their life's fire within them. And it was into these eyes that Clara Ward would look, and in them she would find not duty or arrangement, but the intoxicating promise of freedom. The encounter itself, like so many beginnings, may have been simple. A gathering, perhaps, or an evening where music filled the air and conversation blurred with melody. Rigó's violin sang, and Clara, already restless in her role as Princess de Chimay, must have felt the music enter her like an unspoken answer to questions she had carried for years. Here was not the solemn dignity of her husband, not the watchful eyes of nobility, but the raw immediacy of art and emotion. Rigó's bow drew across the strings, and Clara, listening, may have recognized in those notes the echo of her own heartbeat, the same refusal to remain confined, the same hunger for life unchained. Their glances met, and in that meeting something unspoken yet undeniable passed between them. For Clara, so long contained by the rituals of nobility, the gaze of this musician offered recognition, as if someone finally saw not the heiress, not the princess, but the restless woman within. For Rigo, the beauty of Clara was more than the loveliness of her form. It was the brilliance of a spirit that dared to shimmer where others dimmed. Passion does not always arrive as fire at once. It begins often as a spark, small and almost invisible. But once kindled, it grows until it consumes all else. As days and evenings unfolded, their paths crossed again and again. Conversation deepened, laughter flowed freely, and slowly beneath the polite veneer of society, something more dangerous stirred. Clara's footsteps, once restless in the corridors of Chimay, now found rhythm in secret encounters, in moments stolen between obligations, in the quiet thrill of being seen for who she truly was. Rigo's violin sang in Paris cafes and private salons, and always Clara was drawn to its sound, as though each note was a thread pulling her closer to him. The salons began to whisper more loudly now. The admiration that had once focused on Clara's daring gowns and bold laughter turned into speculation about her heart. They noticed the way her eyes followed the violinist, the way her presence near him seemed brighter, more alive. And scandal, like smoke, began to curl through the air, faint at first but unmistakable. A princess consorting with a musician, such a thing was not merely unusual, it was unthinkable. Her husband must have felt the shift as well. Prince Joseph, proud and dignified, could not have been blind to the growing intimacy between his wife and the violinist. For him, the matter was not merely personal, but political. For a princess was not only a wife, but the bearer of a family's honor. Clara's every action reflected not upon herself alone, but upon the house of Chimay. And yet, for Clara, honor was less important than truth. She could not remain a symbol when her heart longed to live. The passion between Clara and Rigo soon burst beyond the fragile barriers of secrecy. It was not a quiet affair hidden in shadow. It was bold, visible, undeniable. Clara chose not to conceal but to embrace, as though secrecy itself would have been another prison. She abandoned the safety of her noble home and walked instead into the uncertain embrace of love, a choice that shocked not only Belgium but all of Europe. Newspapers seized upon the story, publishing headlines that transformed her from a princess of admiration into a figure of scandal. The heiress who had married into nobility had forsaken her title for a violinist. The tale was retold with both fascination and horror, as though the continent itself could not decide whether to condemn or to marvel. For Clara, the decision was not merely rebellion, it was liberation. To walk at Rigo's side, to be seen in public with him, was to declare herself free from the invisible chains of rank and duty. She no longer cared for the approval of salons or the dignity of her husband's lineage. She cared only for the pulse of life, for the music that seemed to surround her when Rigo was near, for the intoxication of a love chosen rather than arranged. She walked through Paris streets not as a princess guarded, but as a woman unbound, daring the world to look and to judge. Yet freedom carried its cost. The more boldly Clara embraced her passion, the more she was scorned by those who had once admired her. Nobility turned its back. Invitations ceased, newspapers mocked as much as they reported. And yet Clara did not falter. In the cafes of Paris, in the small apartments filled with music and laughter, she found a kind of happiness she had never known in the grand halls of Chimay. To be scorned for living truthfully was, to her, preferable to being praised for living falsely. One can imagine the sound of her silk gown brushing against cobblestones as she walked beside Rigo, her jewels catching the lamplight, not in ballrooms but in narrow streets. To others, it was the sound of disgrace. To Clara, it was the sound of life itself. She had chosen love over rank, passion over duty, freedom over approval. And though the world judged her harshly, she walked unafraid, her eyes as bright as ever. The whispers of salons became the ink of newspapers, and soon all of Europe spoke her name with fascination. Some condemned her as reckless, immoral, and ungrateful. Others admired her daring, seeing in her choice a symbol of rebellion against the rigid codes that bound women of her station. To the world she was scandal, to herself she was simply free. The rustle of silk along the cobblestones does not fade. It lingers, carrying with it the scent of tobacco and perfume, the low hum of violins in a small room, the pulse of a heart that had chosen passion over propriety. And in that rustle is the promise of journeys yet to come, for Clara's steps would not end in Paris, but would carry her across borders, deeper into notoriety, deeper into legend. The silk brushing against stone shifts and becomes curtain fabric drawn back in a cheap room, where love is chosen over luxury, and scandal grows more certain with each passing night. The curtain fabric, coarse and plain, drawn across the window of a modest room, was far removed from the velvet drapes of Chimay. The heavy gold tassels and embroidered silks of her former life were replaced by simple cloth that carried the faint scent of dust and smoke. And yet behind this curtain, Clara Ward sat not as a princess surrounded by order, but as a woman who had chosen her own path, however narrow and uncertain it might be. The rustle of her silk gown against the floor seemed almost out of place in such surroundings, a reminder of the world she had left behind for love, for freedom, for scandal. It was in rooms such as these, modest apartments in Paris and elsewhere, that Clara and János Rigo built their life together, a life of passion lived in defiance of the expectations that had bound her since birth. To the outside world, this was a fall from grandeur into disgrace. The American heiress, once the ornament of Belgian nobility, had abandoned her husband and her title for a violinist of wandering spirit. But to Clara, the smallness of the room, the sparseness of its furnishings, mattered little compared to the largeness of her newfound freedom. What were chandeliers and gilded mirrors compared to the ability to laugh without judgment, to love without restraint, to breathe without the weight of ancestors upon her shoulders? The newspapers, eager to feast upon scandal, printed the tale again and again. Clara was described with a mixture of fascination and condemnation: the runaway princess, the heiress who had turned her back on duty, the woman who had traded palaces for cheap lodgings. Some writers scorned her recklessness, others painted her as a tragic figure, misled by passion. Yet in every version of the story, her name was on the lips of Europe, whispered in cafes, discussed in salons, debated at dinner tables. Clara Ward had become not merely a woman, but a phenomenon, a symbol of everything society feared and desired in equal measure. The choice she made was not without its cost. Invitations from noble houses ceased. Friends of convenience melted away. Her family in America, already bewildered by her marriage to a prince, must have felt both shock and shame at her abandonment of that marriage. And yet, Clara's fortune remained hers, her wealth cushioning the fall that might otherwise have destroyed her. She could afford to scandalize, to defy, to live outside the pale, for her fortune ensured that she would never truly starve, never truly be cast into ruin. In this, she was both vulnerable and invincible, condemned by society, yet still untouchable by its harshest realities. What must those nights have been like in the modest rooms she shared with Rigo? The sound of the violin filling the air, the faint flicker of candlelight casting shadows on walls unadorned, the laughter of two lovers who cared nothing for the world's disapproval. Clara, who once sat beneath chandeliers as an ornament, now sat cross-legged upon a plain chair, her gown loosened, her hair unpinned, her eyes alight not with the glow of duty, but with the brightness of choice. Did she feel regret? Perhaps in fleeting moments. But more often she must have felt exhilaration, the sense that she was living for herself at last. Still, passion and scandal are never steady flames. They flicker, they waver, they consume. The very boldness with which Clara embraced her new life ensured that gossip grew sharper, more cruel. She was seen in cafes and theaters, openly at Rigaud's side, her presence as conspicuous as ever. And the more openly she lived, the more the world judged. For the aristocracy, she became a cautionary tale, a woman who could not be tamed, who had forsaken rank for ruin. For the public, she was a spectacle, a living drama played out upon the streets of Paris and reported in the papers like a serialized story. And yet there was admiration too, hidden in the whispers. Some women bound in marriages that suffocated them must have looked upon Clara with a secret sense of envy. She had dared what they only dreamed. She had broken the chains of expectation, regardless of consequence. Men, too, were fascinated, though their admiration was often tinged with disdain. To them, Clara was both dangerous and desirable, a reminder that wealth and beauty could turn not toward obedience, but toward rebellion. The scandal of Clara's abandonment of her husband spread beyond Belgium and France. It reached across Europe, reported in Germany, in England, in Italy. She became an international curiosity, a figure who embodied both the allure and the peril of the American heiress. No longer simply Clara Ward, she was now Clara the Scandalous, Clara the Infamous, Clara the Defiant. Her name was enough to stir conversation in any salon, her actions dissected as though they held some greater meaning for society itself. But for Clara, the meaning was simpler. She had chosen passion over propriety, love over lineage, herself over others' expectations. And though the world judged her harshly, she refused to retreat. To retreat would have been to admit defeat, to surrender to the chains she had once broken. Instead, she leaned into her role as spectacle, as scandal, even as the rooms she lived in shrank in grandeur compared to the halls she had abandoned. And so the torn pages of newspapers, printed with her story, fluttered across Paris cafes, left behind by readers eager to consume the latest rumor. Each page carried an image of her life, sometimes true, sometimes invented, yet all part of the legend she was becoming. The world no longer cared for the details of her childhood, the shadow of her father, the careful grooming of her youth. It cared only for the spectacle of her fall, for the sight of a princess, choosing love in a cheap room over duty in a chateau. The torn paper drifts still, caught in a gust of wind, carried across cafe tables where strangers sip their wine and whisper her name. And in that drifting page lies the hint of what is yet to come. Clara Ward, not merely as lover or rebel, but as public spectacle, a woman who would embrace scandal so fully that her very life became performance. The page turns in the wind, landing upon a cafe table, where the smoke of cigarettes curls upward, thick and lingering, carrying with it the murmurs of strangers who cannot look away. The page that drifted down upon a cafe table was soon lost beneath the slow rise of cigarette smoke, curling and thick in the air of Paris evenings. That smoke, heavy with the scent of tobacco and touched by the faint sweetness of wine, wrapped itself around voices speaking softly, voices that carried her name with a mixture of fascination and disdain. In such cafes, where the clatter of cups mixed with the shuffle of cards and the hum of conversation, Clara Ward became more than a person. She was a presence, an idea, a story retold until it became a legend in itself. And often enough, she sat within that haze of smoke, not as the distant subject of gossip, but as its living source, boldly present at a small table, her eyes alight with laughter beside the violinist who had captured her heart. The cafe was not a salon, nor a chateau, nor a ballroom shimmering with chandeliers. It was the gathering place of poets, artists, students, and lovers, of those who did not belong to the rigid order of nobility, but to the restless world of the streets. Here Clara seemed to move with greater ease than she ever had among the stiff courtesies of aristocratic life. She was no longer the princess bound to represent a house centuries old. She was Clara, vibrant, daring, and scandalous, her fortune giving her the freedom to occupy spaces where women of her background were seldom seen. Beside her, Janos Rigo played his violin in rooms where the floor creaked and the ceiling hung low with smoke. His music did not echo in gilded halls, but in the warmth of crowded corners, where listeners leaned close and clapped, not with polite restraint but with fervent joy. Clara's presence in these places startled some, delighted others. She sat not as a distant patroness, but as a companion, laughing openly, drinking without pretense, her silks and jewels mingling with the rougher fabrics of those around her. It was this refusal to remain apart, this willingness to step directly into the heart of life, that made her both admired and condemned. The newspapers followed her every movement, turning even her simplest appearance into spectacle. They described her gowns, noting how daringly low they fell across her shoulders. They remarked upon the boldness with which she wore jewels, the audacity of her laughter in places where women of title were expected never to tread. Each article both scolded and celebrated, for scandal was as profitable for the press as it was destructive for reputation. Clara became a story told again and again, each telling reshaping her into something larger than herself: the runaway princess, the defiant heiress, the woman who scorned propriety for passion. Society recoiled, yet could not look away. To the nobility, she was a fallen figure, her name now a shadow upon the house she had once entered with such promise. To the wider public, she was entertainment, a drama unfolding in real time, a reminder that even those who lived in castles could choose ruin if they chose love. Some whispered that she was reckless, foolish, blinded by desire. Others, more secretly, whispered that she was courageous, that she lived the life so many longed for but dared not claim. In the smoke-filled cafes, Clara's defiance seemed almost tangible. She leaned across tables, her laughter spilling into the night air, her gaze unafraid to meet those who stared. If anyone doubted that she had chosen this life willingly, they had only to see her eyes, alive with a freedom that no title had ever given her. She was not ashamed. She was not repentant. She was radiant with the knowledge that she had broken free from the prison of expectation. Yet scandal, once embraced, never remains still. It grows, it feeds upon itself, it demands ever greater boldness. Clara, who once shocked with a daring gown or a public appearance, soon found that even those were not enough to satisfy a world hungry for her spectacle, and so her defiance deepened. She appeared more often, more openly, with Rigo at her side. She walked through streets where all could see. She dined in places where gossip could not be contained. She turned her life into a performance that no one could ignore. There was, in her choices, both triumph and danger. Triumph, because she had seized her own narrative, refusing to be hidden or silenced by the disapproval of nobility. Danger, because in doing so, she ensured that she would never be forgiven. For women of her time, scandal was not a passing storm, but a mark that lingered, a shadow that followed until the end. Clara did not seem to care. She seemed to wear the shadow like another garment, daring and brilliant, as if it, too, could be fashioned into beauty. Still, one wonders whether in the quiet hours, when the cafes emptied and the smoke thinned, Clara ever felt the weight of what she had lost. The grandeur of halls, the deference of titles, the security of position, all these were gone. In their place she had laughter, music, love, and the uncertain admiration of strangers who found in her both a caution and an inspiration. Was it enough? Did she ever long for the velvet curtains she had abandoned, or did she find in the coarse fabric of her new life a comfort more real than silk could ever provide? The cigarette smoke lingered in the air long after voices had faded, curling upward into the night, into silence. And as it lingered, so too did the image of Clara Ward, a woman both condemned and celebrated, walking unafraid in the half-light between admiration and scorn. Her scandal was no longer a secret. It was her identity, her legacy, her chosen stage. The smoke curls higher, twisting like a ribbon, until it becomes not merely haze but memory. And in that curling memory appears the image of fabric again, this time not curtains drawn in secrecy, but the fabric of gowns themselves. Gowns cut lower, gowns more daring, gowns that shocked as much as they entranced. The cigarette smoke curling upward seemed to twist itself into threads, and those threads in turn wove themselves into fabric, as if the haze of a cafe could become the very cloth of Clara Ward's gowns. And here, in these gowns, her rebellion took on its most visible form. For fashion was never merely a matter of dress. It was a language, a declaration, a way of turning the body itself into an argument. Clara, once confined by the modest silks and stiff bodices of noble life, now chose garments that spoke openly of defiance, of boldness, of a refusal to be silenced. The seam of propriety, once tightly stitched, began to loosen beneath her fingers, until even her clothing seemed to fall into scandal. Paris had long been the city where fashion was both spectacle and power. The ateliers of the great couturiers, the glittering displays in windows along the boulevards, the shimmering gowns at soirées, all were part of a silent competition in which women of society sought not only to display their wealth, but to proclaim their refinement. In this contest, Clara entered not with subtlety, but with audacity. Her gowns were cut lower at the shoulder, their fabrics clinging with greater intimacy, their colors chosen not to blend into the candlelight, but to blaze against it. Where other women softened themselves into shadows of lace and modesty, Clara turned her body into a flame that demanded to be seen. The effect was immediate. Salons murmured of her boldness. Newspapers described her gowns with relish, often in tones of scandal disguised as observation. She was said to bear more of herself than was proper, to move with too much freedom in garments meant to constrain. Each new appearance was noted, dissected, and retold, as though every gown she wore was a new act in the ongoing theater of her life. Clara had become not only a scandalous figure, but a fashion spectacle, her body the stage upon which rebellion was performed. To wear such gowns was not a matter of vanity alone. For Clara, it was a deliberate act of self-possession. Her body, once treated as ornament to a husband's name, was now her own. By revealing what others demanded she conceal, she reclaimed power over her presence. Each neckline lowered, each seam daringly placed, each fabric chosen to embrace rather than to obscure, declared that she would no longer be hidden or owned. She was not ashamed of being looked upon. She demanded it, and in demanding it, she unsettled a society that had long relied upon women's silence. In the gaslit cafes, she arrived in these gowns not as a noblewoman disguised among the people, but as herself, unrepentant. Men stared, women whispered, the press scribbled notes to be turned into the morning's copy. Clara moved through it all with a calm that was almost theatrical, as if she understood perfectly that she was playing a role and had chosen to embrace it. She had become both actress and audience, both subject and critic, in a play whose script she wrote each time she dressed. Yet there was danger in this language of fashion. To expose herself so boldly was to invite the sharpest condemnation. The nobility, already scandalized by her departure from her husband, now found in her clothing proof of their suspicions, that she was indecent, immoral, unworthy of her title. The more she dressed as she pleased, the more she was stripped, in their eyes, of dignity. But Clara no longer sought dignity as they defined it. To her, dignity was found not in obedience but in defiance, not in modest concealment but in fearless display. It is tempting to imagine the moments before she stepped into the world, when she stood before a mirror adjusting the fall of fabric, the angle of a hat, the glimmer of a necklace at her throat? Did she smile at her reflection, knowing the stir she would cause? Did she feel nervous beneath her confidence, or was she by then so accustomed to the eyes of others that she welcomed their judgment? Perhaps she thought of herself as a performer, each appearance a scene, each gown a costume that turned gossip into inevitability. Still, fashion was not only scandal, it was also beauty. Those who condemned her could not deny that she was radiant, that the lines of her dresses suited her form, that she carried herself with grace even in defiance. For in Clara, there was no clumsiness, no awkwardness of rebellion. She moved with a confidence that made even impropriety seem deliberate, as though she herself defined what was proper simply by choosing it. This was her true power, to turn disobedience into elegance, scandal into spectacle, rebellion into allure. But every performance leaves its trace, and every gown, once worn, must be put away. Did she ever, in the solitude of her room, run her hand along the seams of her dresses, feeling the thread as a reminder of the fragile line between approval and condemnation? Did she ever imagine what her life might have been had she chosen another path? Modesty, silence, obedience? Or did she laugh at the very thought, finding the idea of such a life as dull and lifeless as the rooms she had once paced in Chimay? The world continued to watch. Each gown became another chapter, another opportunity for admiration or scorn. And as Clara lived more openly, the spectacle of her life deepened. She was no longer only a woman who had left her husband for love. She was now a figure of ongoing performance, her very appearance a provocation. Fashion, once meant to conceal or to flatter, had become her manifesto, written not with ink, but with silk and skin. The loose seam that once hinted at rebellion now seemed to unravel entirely, leaving her presence half-clothed in daring, half-clothed in rumor. And into that unraveling slipped another sound, softer but more insistent. The sound of a violin string vibrating in the smoky air of a small hall, reminding her that love, not fashion alone, was the fire that fed her defiance. The seam gives way to the trembling note of a violin, fading into the night, calling her not only to spectacle, but to the stage itself, where applause and ridicule would mingle as one. The trembling note of the violin lingered in the smoky air like a thread of silver, quivering, alive, and then dissolving into silence. From that silence arose a murmur, a rustle of movement, a gathering of voices and eyes. Clara Ward, once a princess of noble halls, now stepped into another kind of chamber, one not lined with portraits and gilded mirrors, but with faces turned expectantly toward her. For in time, her life, already lived as spectacle, drifted further into performance itself. What had begun as scandalous presence in cafes and salons became appearances upon stages, where applause and ridicule mingled, and where Clara embraced yet another transformation, from heiress to princess to tabloid figure to performer whose very existence blurred the line between private life and public theater. To appear upon a stage was no small step for a woman of her background. It was the final abandonment of noble restraint, for to perform was to admit that one sought not discretion, but attention, not silence, but voice. Yet Clara had long since ceased to care for the judgments of those who scorned her. If they would watch, she would give them something to see. If they would speak, she would give them words worth uttering. In this way, performance became not degradation but defiance, a means of taking hold of the narrative that others had tried to write for her. Her stage was not the opera, nor the theater of grand renown, but smaller halls where curiosity gathered in smoky clouds. Crowds came not only for the music of Rigaud's violin, but for the sight of Clara herself, adorned in gowns as daring as ever, her beauty as luminous under gaslight as it had been beneath chandeliers. She was spectacle, curiosity, scandal and art, all in one. When she entered, the room shifted. Some clapped, some whispered, some smirked, yet all looked. Clara, who once had been the subject of gossip written by others, now wrote her own gossip upon the stage of her body and her presence. The music of Rigo, always near her, provided the undercurrent to these performances. His violin sang with passion, notes soaring and breaking, carrying into the hearts of listeners emotions too raw for polite salons. And beside that music, Clara embodied its spirit. She too was a note trembling, alive, breaking against the expectations of her world. Theirs was not the polished harmony of noble life, but the wild improvisation of passion, of risk, of defiance. And in these performances the audience saw both, the musician and his scandalous lover, the runaway princess turned bohemian muse. What did she feel, standing before such crowds? Did she sense ridicule in the murmurs, or did she savor the thrill of being looked upon, of commanding attention on her own terms? Perhaps she felt both at once. Applause could never fully silence the whispers of contempt, yet neither could contempt erase the exhilaration of applause. The two wove together into a strange symphony, a mixture of triumph and humiliation, which Clara, bold as ever, embraced rather than resisted. The press, of course, seized upon these appearances. Columns described her gowns with the same breathless detail they once reserved for royal weddings, only now with tones of scandal rather than admiration. They remarked upon the impropriety of a princess-turned-performer, upon the shocking brazenness of her defiance, upon the curious blend of beauty and disgrace that seemed to cling to her. And yet the very same papers that scolded her also profited from her, for readers devoured every word, eager to know what Clara Ward had done, what she had worn, whom she had defied. She was their cautionary tale, their guilty fascination, their endless story. To live so publicly was to risk becoming more symbol than self. Clara's name no longer referred to a woman alone, but to an image constructed in the imaginations of others, an image of rebellion, scandal, disgrace, glamour. Yet Clara herself seemed to accept this, perhaps even to revel in it. Better to be a scandal remembered than an obedient wife forgotten. Better to be whispered about in cafes and applauded upon stages than to wither unseen in a gilded cage. Her choices had stripped her of the respect of nobility, but had granted her something else, notoriety, which in its own way is a form of immortality. And yet, within this strange immortality, there was fragility. To be loved for scandal is to be loved conditionally, for audiences are fickle, and fascination soon demands more. Did Clara ever sense this, in the way eyes looked at her more hungrily than kindly, in the way applause sometimes rang hollow, in the way her presence was consumed as quickly as a headline? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she knew that the same world that had raised her into notoriety would one day cast her aside, as it always does with those who live too boldly. And perhaps this knowledge only deepened her resolve to live while she could, to shine as long as she had light to give, to embrace each gaze no matter how fleeting. The violin note fades, but its echo remains, haunting the room long after the bow has lifted. The applause rises, then diminishes, replaced by murmurs, by smoke, by silence. Clara steps off the stage, her gown trailing, her face illuminated by a smile that is part triumph, part weariness. Behind her, the stage grows dim. Ahead of her, another uncertain night awaits, another performance, another gaze, another whisper. Her life has become endless theater, each act blending into the next, and as the lights dim in the hall, the violin's fading note turns inward, into solitude, into loneliness. For even applause cannot silence the quiet truth that waits when the crowd disperses, when the music stops, when the performer returns to herself. The applause dissolves into silence, and within that silence lingers a heaviness, a loneliness that no stage can disguise, a loneliness that begins to press upon Clara's heart as the nights grow longer. The applause, that storm of hands and voices, eventually thinned and fell away, leaving only the echo of its rhythm in Clara's ears. She stepped down from the stage with her smile still fixed, her gown trailing behind her. But when the doors closed and the lamps dimmed, there was no more music, no more admiration, only silence. And within that silence lay a loneliness that applause could never banish, a solitude that grows heavier with each cheer that fades too quickly. The violin's trembling note lingered faintly, but now it was less a song of triumph and more a whisper of sorrow. For in the quiet hours after performance, Clara was left with the truth that passion and scandal, though intoxicating, could also be weary companions. The life she had chosen with János Rigo was built upon fire, and fire, by its nature, burns both brightly and destructively. In the first flush of their love, every moment had been electric, the thrill of defiance, the sweetness of forbidden freedom, the heady rush of scandal. But passion is a flame that consumes, and Clara, who once had seemed inexhaustible in her daring, began to feel its toll. The late nights, the endless whispers, the sharp gazes of strangers. It was a life lived always in the public eye, never hidden, never at rest. And the more the world consumed her story, the more fragile she became within it. Rigo, too, carried his burdens. His music, once the pure expression of his soul, was now entangled with Clara's scandal. To many, he was not simply a violinist, but the man who had lured away a princess, the shadow behind her disgrace. Their love, which had begun as liberation, was now stained with the judgments of thousands. The strain of this weighed upon them both. In their small rooms, where once they had laughed freely, silence sometimes stretched long between them. The very closeness that had drawn them together now became a cage of its own, one without grandeur, but with its own kind of confinement. Did Clara ever wonder in these nights whether she had traded one prison for another? She had abandoned the heavy halls of Chimay for freedom, and yet her freedom was bound by scandal's chains. She was no longer confined by duty, but by notoriety. Every choice she made was no longer her own, but a spectacle for others to interpret, to judge, to consume. And the man beside her, once her rescuer from the suffocation of nobility, was now part of that cage. Love is not always steady. It bends under weight. It strains under pressure. For Clara and Rigo, the weight of scandal pressed heavily until their passion, once joyous, grew marked by fatigue. And still she remained visible. She walked the streets of Paris in daring gowns. She appeared at cafes. She lingered at performances. She refused to retreat into obscurity, for retreat would have been surrender, and Clara had never been one to bow. Yet each appearance carried a hollowness, a sense that she was now playing a role even in her rebellion. The crowd still looked, still whispered, still applauded and condemned, but Clara herself felt the thinness of it. To live always in the gaze of others was to lose the quiet space where one might belong only to oneself. There were quarrels, as lovers often have, but in Clara's life those quarrels carried the weight of an entire continent's judgment. When she and Rigo fought, it was not only two lovers struggling, it was the princess and the violinist, the scandal that Europe watched with hungry eyes. Did she still love him with the same fierce devotion as when she had abandoned all for his sake? Or did she, in darker moments, feel a bitterness, a suspicion that her freedom had been less about love and more about flight, that she had run from one cage into the arms of another? These questions, though perhaps unspoken, lingered between them like smoke that refuses to clear. And so the violin's song, once sweet, grew mournful. The bow moved across the strings with the same skill, but the notes carried sorrow now, fatigue, even resignation. Clara listened, and perhaps she felt her own heart within that music, recognizing the sadness that had crept into her once liberating fire. Theirs was still a bond, but it was no longer untroubled. The scandal that had made them famous also made their love fragile, tested at every turn by the world's eyes and their own weariness. In these later years of their union, Clara began to drift further into the arms of notoriety itself. If love faltered, scandal remained faithful. The world still wanted her, still consumed her story, still whispered her name. And so, even as her heart grew weary, she continued to step boldly into the gaze of others, finding in their fascination a substitute for what passion no longer fully gave her. She had become a creature of scandal as much as of love, sustained by the very attention that also exhausted her. One wonders if, in the solitude of her room, she ever longed for silence. Not the silence of halls where duty smothered her, but the silence of anonymity, where no one looked, no one judged, no one cared. Yet such silence was denied her. Once a life becomes spectacle, it cannot easily return to obscurity. Clara's fate was bound to visibility, to being seen always, even when she wished to vanish. The loneliness of applause grew heavier with time, and the flame of passion, once fierce, now flickered uncertainly. Clara's beauty still shone, her gowns still dazzled, her defiance still unsettled, but within her was a fatigue that neither wealth nor notoriety could ease. Love had carried her out of Chimay, but scandal carried her further still, into a life where passion was both salvation and burden. The violin's last note quivered, trembling in the silence of a small hall, and then fell still. Clara listened, and in that stillness felt both the love that had freed her and the weight that now bound her. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing, a reminder of all that had been lost and of all that still might be taken. And into that silence broke another sound, a train whistle, low and distant, carrying across the night air, a sound of movement, of departure, of journeys yet to come, journeys that would take Clara far from Paris, far from Rigaud, far from the stage, into new places where scandal would follow her still. The violin's silence gives way to the train's whistle, faint but insistent, promising departure and the restless continuation of a life that could never remain still. The whistle of the train stretched across the night like a call to those who could not rest in one place, a summons to the restless, the wandering, the dissatisfied. For Clara Ward, that sound was not merely an echo in the distance, but an invitation, one she could never resist. The whistle carried her beyond Paris, beyond the worn rhythm of her life with Rigaud, toward new horizons where scandal would not vanish, but would instead take on new shapes. Trains in those years were more than machines of steel and steam. They were vessels of transformation, bearing souls from one chapter of their story to the next. And so Clara, wrapped still in silks though weary from notoriety, stepped once more into motion. The train bore her southward, its carriages rattling through landscapes that unfolded like painted scenes, glimpsed through windows. Fields gave way to forests, forests to mountains, mountains to the shimmer of the Mediterranean. The sun grew warmer, the air sharper with salt and pine, and soon Clara found herself in Monte Carlo, a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single night, where scandal was not only tolerated but expected. If Paris had offered cafes thick with smoke and gossip, Monte Carlo offered roulette wheels spinning beneath gilded ceilings, laughter edged with desperation, and nights that seemed to stretch beyond dawn. Here, among the gamblers and dreamers, Clara's presence was once again impossible to ignore. She appeared in gowns cut as daringly as ever, her jewels catching the lamplight of the casino, her eyes alive with the reckless sparkle of someone who had long since ceased to measure her actions by others' standards. Men watched her with fascination, women with disapproval, and the croupiers, with their steady hands and blank expressions, could not help but glance at her beauty as they spun the wheel. To watch Clara at the gaming table was to see not merely a player, but a performance. Each gesture, each smile, Each lean across the green felt a reminder that she had turned her life into theater. The wheel spun, and in its spinning was reflected the very essence of her existence: chance, risk, fortune gained and lost, the thrill of uncertainty. Clara played not only with coins but with reputation, with identity, with the very fabric of her legacy. The crowd that gathered around her did not watch to see whether she won or lost. They watched to see Clara herself, the scandalous princess, the runaway heiress, the woman who had traded palaces for passion and now staked her fortune against the turning of a wheel. From Monte Carlo she drifted onward to Italy, where the sun burned golden upon terracotta roofs and the sea pressed itself endlessly against the shore. There, too, her presence became a story retold. She was seen upon promenades lined with palms, her gowns bright against the Mediterranean light, her laughter carrying across cafes where artists and aristocrats mingled uneasily. New companions appeared at her side, men drawn not only to her beauty but to her fame, eager to bask for a moment in the glow of her notoriety. Clara's heart, restless as ever, was not bound to one man alone. If Rigo had once been her passion, he was no longer her only fire. Scandal had become her constant lover, always near, always faithful, always demanding more. Each new affair whispered of in hotel corridors and scribbled into the notebooks of gossip columnists became part of her legend. She was no longer only the American heiress who had shocked Europe with her defiance. She was now a wanderer whose every step trailed rumor behind it. Wherever she appeared, scandal arrived first, seated invisibly at her side, ready to be confirmed by her presence. She did not deny it. Perhaps she even welcomed it. To deny would have been to surrender. To welcome was to remain in control. And so Clara lived as though each new city, each new companion, each new whisper were another act in the endless play she performed before the eyes of the world. And yet, beneath the brilliance of Monte Carlo's lamps, beneath the warmth of Italy's sun, there must have been moments when Clara felt the fatigue of her own performance. Passion thrills, but it also tires. Scandal excites, but it also isolates. Did she ever pause on a balcony overlooking the sea, the salt air lifting her hair, and feel for a moment the loneliness of a life lived always in the gaze of others? Did she ever long for a single day in which her name was not spoken, in which she might walk unnoticed, free of both admiration and condemnation? If she did, she gave no outward sign. Her gowns remained daring, her laughter loud, her presence undeniable. To the world she remained a flame, but even flames, when they burn too brightly, consume themselves. The roulette wheel in Monte Carlo spun again and again, the ball rattling, bouncing, landing upon red or black, fortune or loss. Each spin mirrored Clara's own life, a gamble without certainty, a thrill that carried both joy and danger. She leaned forward, eyes alight, as the ball fell into place, and for a moment she looked as she always had, alive with freedom, radiant with defiance. And yet behind that radiance the fatigue remained, the shadow that grew longer with each year of scandal. Still, she pressed forward. To retreat was unthinkable, to return to respectability impossible. Clara had chosen her path long ago, and now she walked it with the same boldness that had once carried her out of Chimay's halls. She remained a spectacle, a story, a legend in motion, moving from Paris to Monte Carlo to Italy and beyond, leaving in her wake the whispers of lovers, the laughter of admirers, the scorn of critics, and the fascination of strangers. The wheel spins still, its motion slowing, the ball rattling toward its resting place. Around it, the crowd leans closer, waiting, breath held. And as the wheel turns, its spin fades into another image, into the dim reflection of a mirror, where Clara, now older, gazes at herself in candlelight. The brilliance of her beauty still present but softened, her eyes holding a question that even she cannot answer. The roulette wheel slows, and in its final motion becomes the shimmer of a mirror catching dim light, reflecting both the radiance of Clara's presence and the shadow of the years that lay ahead. The roulette wheel slowed, the small ivory ball rattled once more, and then the motion of chance dissolved into stillness, and in its stillness the world seemed to shift. That circle of fortune became the round shimmer of a mirror catching dim light. And there, in its reflection, Clara Ward looked upon herself. The candle at her side burned low, its flame unsteady, and in that wavering light she saw both the radiance that had carried her through Europe and the faint lines of years spent in constant display. She was still beautiful, still striking, her presence still enough to draw eyes wherever she went, yet there was now something different, something of the weight of middle age, something of the fragility that scandal could not disguise. In these years, Clara no longer carried the shock of newness, the scandal of her elopement with Rigo, the defiance of her gowns, the daring of her presence. These were no longer fresh tales whispered with astonishment. They were familiar now, part of her legend, part of the expectation that clung to her name. She was no longer only a woman. She was a spectacle, a curiosity to be observed, admired, and sometimes pitied. People came not only to see her beauty, but to measure its endurance, to marvel that she still dared to appear in public with the same audacity that had once stunned them. Clara had become her own myth, and like all myths, she was both celebrated and diminished by repetition. The mirror revealed what others saw, but it also revealed what only she could know. Behind the brightness of her eyes was a weariness, a heaviness carried from years of being consumed by the gaze of others. To be always watched is to be always performed, and Clara had been performing for decades now. Each gown, each appearance, each laugh had become an act, one she had mastered but one that left her with little rest. She leaned close to the mirror, perhaps, and saw in her reflection not only the defiant heiress she once was, but the fading child of Detroit who had long ago been shaped by wealth, by loss, by expectation. The two faces, the young girl and the middle-aged woman, seemed to blur in the dim candlelight, leaving her uncertain which was truer. Her lovers had changed, as lovers always do when passion is sought more than permanence. Rigo had remained for a time, then drifted, replaced by others, each of them fascinated by her name, her wealth, her notoriety. Clara's love affairs had become less about passion and more about motion, as though she moved from one man to another in the same way she moved from city to city, always restless, always searching, never still. Each new companion brought whispers, each whisper renewed her legend, but none of them seemed to still the deeper hunger within her. Was she seeking love, or was she seeking the feeling of being alive that love once gave her? Perhaps she no longer knew. The mirror also reflected the change in how society regarded her. Where once she had been admired for daring, she was now regarded with a certain condescension. She was no longer the radiant scandal of youth, but the aging beauty who refused to retreat, who clung too fiercely to a notoriety that time would not sustain. Some pitied her, others mocked her, yet all still looked. For even diminished, Clara Ward was never invisible. She remained a presence that could not be ignored, a woman whose very existence unsettled the boundaries of what was expected. In Monte Carlo, in Paris, in Rome, she continued to appear, still dazzling in her gowns, still bold in her laughter, but the crowds gathered less for admiration and more for curiosity. They wanted to see how she had changed, whether scandal still clung to her as fiercely as it once had, whether her beauty could endure against the erosion of years. Clara, ever defiant, gave them what they sought. She dressed as daringly as before. She smiled as brightly. She walked with the same unapologetic presence. If time had marked her, she refused to let it show. The mirror might reveal her weariness, but in public she remained luminous. And yet, There must have been moments when she felt the sting of what she had lost. Once she had been a princess, courted by nobility, admired across continents. Now she was a curiosity, a figure of scandal too familiar to shock, too notorious to ignore, too marked to ever regain the dignity she had cast aside. Did she regret it? Perhaps in fleeting moments, though Clara was never one to dwell in remorse. More likely, she embraced her role, accepting that scandal had become her identity, that notoriety was her true inheritance. Better, she may have thought, to remain visible in disgrace than to fade into the obscurity of obedience. The mirror caught the flicker of her candle and cast it back into her eyes. She leaned closer, perhaps, tracing with her hand the jewels at her throat, the silk at her shoulders, the faint lines upon her skin. Did she ask herself then what she had truly gained? Did she measure the price of her freedom against the weight of her infamy? Or did she, as she often had, simply smile at her reflection, amused by the world's judgments, unwilling to surrender even to her own doubts? Clara remained in these years both radiant and tragic. Radiant because her spirit still burned, her defiance still shone, her presence still unsettled. Tragic because the flame that once burned for passion now burned only for its own survival, feeding itself upon the curiosity of others. She had become a spectacle not only to the world but to herself, trapped between admiration and pity, never free from either. The candle burned lower, its flame guttering in the still air, and in its dim light the mirror seemed almost to fade. Clara's reflection wavered, softened, became less distinct. The woman gazing back was not only the heiress, the princess, the scandal, but also a soul growing weary, a figure whose light might soon be dimmed by time itself. And as the flame bent low, it left behind a shadow, a reminder that every brilliance carries its end. The mirror fades into candlelight, the glow soft and uncertain, flickering as though it too were tired, as though it could no longer promise permanence. The flame bends and wavers, and its smoke drifts upward into darkness, leaving Clara surrounded not by mirrors or gowns, but by the fragile light of time itself. The candle bent low, its flame trembling as if it too had grown weary from the long hours of watching. A curl of smoke rose, dark and wavering, as the wax thinned to its base. That fading light became the atmosphere of Clara Ward's later years, when the brilliance that once seemed inexhaustible began to falter, when fortune, beauty, and notoriety all grew fragile, clinging to her as if reluctant to depart, yet unable to remain unaltered. What had once been a fire of scandal and freedom was now a flickering candle, its smoke drifting through the rooms of her life. In these years, Clara found that her fortune, so immense in her youth, no longer stretched endlessly. The estates of her father, the wealth that had once made her irresistible to nobility, had been diminished by time, by extravagance, by the endless costs of maintaining a life lived as spectacle. Money that had once purchased gowns and jewels with careless ease was now spent with greater caution, and though she never sank into poverty, she felt the narrowing of her means as a kind of insult. For Clara was a woman who had been raised in abundance, who had never known the limits of want. To feel wealth retreat was to feel the edges of her freedom threatened. Her beauty, too, though still striking, carried the weight of years. Admirers who once marveled at her freshness now spoke in tones tinged with surprise, remarking not that she dazzled, but that she still dazzled. The distinction was cruel. A woman celebrated for her beauty finds herself living in constant negotiation with time, as though her very worth is measured against the endurance of her features. Clara, who had turned her presence into a weapon, now found herself wielding a blade dulled by age. She dressed as boldly as ever, but where once her gowns had shocked, they now seemed almost desperate in the eyes of some, as though she were clinging to youth that would not remain. Society, always fickle, regarded her with a different gaze now. The scandal that once thrilled had grown familiar, even stale. New names rose in the gossip columns, new dramas filled the pages of newspapers, and Clara, though still present, no longer commanded the same astonishment. She was known, yes, but less as the embodiment of daring than as a relic of scandal past, a figure whose notoriety had become habitual. To live as scandal is to live in constant need of novelty, and Clara, aging, found herself struggling to provide it. Yet she did not retreat. Retreat was never in her nature. If the world would no longer marvel at her as it once had, then she would continue to present herself, unbowed, as though to insist that she still belonged in its gaze. She attended gatherings, though smaller and less grand than before. She walked the boulevards, though now fewer heads turned. She appeared still in daring gowns, still in jewels that glittered in dimmer light, still laughing too freely, still refusing to bend. And if some whispered that she looked diminished, that she clung to scandal too long, Clara seemed not to hear. To acknowledge decline would have been to admit defeat, and Clara Ward had built her life upon refusal. In the dim light of her later years, scandal itself became her sustenance. Where love had once driven her rebellion, where passion had once fueled her choices, now scandal alone kept her alive in the world's imagination. She embraced it, leaned into it, perhaps even exaggerated it, for it was the one constant she could depend upon. Money dwindled, beauty faded, lovers drifted, but scandal endured. Scandal was her true companion, the thread that tied each chapter of her life together, the identity she could never shed even if she wished. But what does it mean to live as scandal itself? To be admired not for virtue, but for audacity, not for kindness, but for daring, not for wisdom, but for defiance. It is to live in a kind of exile, never fully embraced, never fully forgotten, always visible, yet always at a distance. Clara had chosen this exile long ago, but in her later years, its loneliness grew heavier. She was surrounded by people, yet always apart. She was spoken of constantly, yet rarely known. She lived in the gaze of the world, but that gaze was often sharper than it was warm. And still, she laughed. Still, she adorned herself. Still, she walked with her head high, as though daring the world to see in her not decline but endurance. Perhaps she knew that scandal, for all its cruelty, had granted her a legacy few others could claim. For how many women of her time, bound by duty and silence, were remembered at all? Clara, scandalous, infamous, unrepentant, ensured that her name would linger. In this she found her victory, however fragile, however costly. The candle guttered lower, its flame almost extinguished, yet still clinging stubbornly to the wick. Clara, too, clung stubbornly to her role, refusing to vanish, refusing to accept obscurity. She had lived as a flame, and she would not go quietly into shadow. But the smoke rising above her reminded her, perhaps, that all flames must fade. In her private hours, away from the eyes of admirers and critics alike, she must have felt this truth more keenly. Alone in her chamber, perhaps with only the faint rustle of curtains and the ticking of a clock, she may have asked herself whether she had lived as she wished, whether her defiance had been freedom or only another form of captivity. Did she regret the paths she had taken, or did she smile at the very thought of regret, dismissing it as a weakness she refused to indulge? The mirror, the candle, the silence, they alone knew the answer. The candle's smoke drifted upward, curling into shapes unseen, dissolving into air. That smoke, soft and elusive, seemed to carry with it memories of another place, another time. For even as she clung to scandal in Europe, the thought of America, of Detroit, of the life she had once left, remained like a shadow in her mind. The smoke became the haze of memory, the distance of oceans, the echo of a home she could never fully return to. The guttering flame dies at last, and in its smoke rises a memory of distant shores, of America left behind, of Detroit where a restless girl once dreamed of freedom before scandal gave it to her in another form. The smoke from the extinguished candle rose softly, curling into the air, dissolving into forms that the eye could not quite hold. And in those curling shapes, Clara Ward might have seen not the faces of Paris or Monte Carlo, not the glitter of gowns or the gleam of roulette wheels, but the faint outline of a distant shore. The smoke became the mist over the Great Lakes, the breath of winter air upon the streets of Detroit, the echo of bells that had once tolled across her childhood. For though Clara had long since left America, it lingered within her as both memory and ghost, a place she had abandoned but never entirely forgotten. Detroit in her memory was not the Detroit of her present age, not the restless city of engines and factories it would become, but the Detroit of her youth, streets lined with wooden houses, the river flowing broad and gray, the sound of carriages rattling upon cobblestones, the scent of pine and coal mingling in the sharp winter air. She remembered the home of her father, Captain Eber Brock Ward, a man of wealth and ambition whose empire of iron and ships had made her an heiress before she had even learned to walk. She remembered the silence of his absence after death, the way fortune pressed upon her even as it orphaned her. She remembered her mother's care, the lessons, the piano, the lace curtains through which she had once gazed with longing, wondering what lay beyond. These memories rose now like smoke, soft and indistinct, yet filled with the ache of distance. Clara had left America not unwillingly but with eagerness, ready to embrace the grandeur of Europe, the titles and palaces that fortune promised her. And yet, as scandal consumed her life abroad, as notoriety replaced admiration, there must have been nights when she wondered whether she had truly found freedom or whether she had simply exchanged one set of chains for another. Did she, in those moments, imagine what her life might have been had she remained in Detroit? Had she married an American magnate rather than a Belgian prince? Had she lived quietly within the circles of wealth without crossing the ocean into scandal? Perhaps she did, but perhaps more often she laughed at such imaginings, for Clara was not made for quiet lives. Even if she had stayed, her restless spirit would have sought rebellion in some other form. And yet, the thought of her homeland never left her entirely. The distance between Europe and America was not only of oceans, but of memory, of identity. Clara had become a European figure, a scandal of salons and newspapers, yet she remained at her core the daughter of Detroit, the child of American wealth, the girl who had once pressed her fingers to piano keys and dreamed of the unknown. The press never let her forget it either. No matter what she became, she was always the American heiress, a phrase that clung to her as persistently as scandal itself. Her mother's voice may have echoed in her memory, her siblings, her family, whose lives continued across the ocean without her. Did they read of her scandals in American newspapers, shaking their heads, sighing at how far she had strayed? Did they remember the girl she had once been, before Europe remade her into a story too large for any family to contain? Clara never returned to live in America, but America returned to her, again and again, as shadow and as echo. Perhaps in her solitude, she walked to the window and imagined the ships that crossed the Atlantic, carrying others back and forth, bridging worlds she had sundered. The sight of a harbor must have stirred in her the faint ache of memory. The day she had first boarded a ship as a young woman, her fortune and beauty carrying her across the water toward a future she could never have imagined. Now, older, she must have wondered whether that voyage had been destiny or error, triumph or tragedy. The smoke of the candle, rising and vanishing, seemed to whisper that such questions could never be answered. Detroit was no longer the city she had left. Time had altered it as surely as it had altered her. The world of her childhood was gone, as her father was gone, as her youth was gone. Yet memory, like smoke, clings to the air even after the flame has burned away. Clara carried that memory not as nostalgia, but as reminder. For even in scandal, even in notoriety, even in exile, she was never entirely free of where she had come from. To be an heiress was to be bound by inheritance, and inheritance, unlike beauty, could not fade with age. The image of Detroit lingered in her mind, the church bell tolling, the snow gathering upon ledges, the piano in the parlor where her fingers once traced uncertain melodies. That young girl had dreamed of Europe, and Europe had given her both title and scandal, both passion and loneliness. Was it worth the exchange? The smoke that rose from the candle did not answer, only drifted upward, dissolving into nothing, leaving her alone with the question. And yet, even as she remembered Detroit, Clara's life did not turn backward. She did not return. Her restlessness remained stronger than her longing. The America of her childhood became a ghost, but Europe was still her stage, still her theater of scandal and spectacle. The smoke of memory faded into the horizon of the sea, where ships departed and disappeared, carrying others back, while Clara remained, tied forever to the continent, where she had become legend. The horizon, wide and endless, stretched in her imagination, and upon it a ship moved slowly, its sails dim against the setting sun. The smoke of the candle became the smoke of its funnel, carrying it farther and farther, until it was only a shadow, then only a memory. Clara watched it vanish, just as she had once watched the American shore recede behind her, just as she now watched her past dissolve into distance. The ship fades into the horizon, its outline swallowed by twilight, and as the sea darkens, the horizon itself transforms into the twilight streets of Paris, where lamps glow softly and Clara walks once more, older now, her steps slower, her presence still luminous but haunted by the ghosts of what has been lost. The ship that disappeared upon the horizon seemed to melt into the slow darkening of the sea, and in that darkening, the horizon reshaped itself into the narrow streets of Paris at twilight. Lamps flickered into life one by one, casting pools of golden light upon wet cobblestones. The air was filled with the muffled sound of wheels upon stone, the distant murmur of voices drifting from cafes, and the faint scent of chestnuts roasting by street vendors. Into this twilight, Clara Ward walked, older now, her figure still graceful, her eyes still luminous, but her steps slower, her presence softer, touched by the weight of years. She was no longer the dazzling princess who shocked Europe with her defiance. She was something more spectral, more elusive, a living reminder of scandals past, a ghost walking among the cities she once commanded. In Paris, Clara remained known, but not in the way she once had been. Her name still carried weight, still stirred memories of headlines and whispers, but now it was spoken less often with excitement and more with curiosity tinged by pity. To younger generations, she was a tale told by their elders, a story of the American heiress who had married a prince and abandoned him for love, who had defied society and turned herself into spectacle. They remembered the outlines of the legend, but not its fire. And so, when Clara appeared upon boulevards or at small gatherings, she was looked upon not as scandal incarnate, but as a remnant, a woman who carried the shadows of a past era. Her gowns remained daring, though less shocking than before. Time itself had made them less a declaration of rebellion and more an eccentricity, something people remarked upon with indulgence rather than outrage. She still wore jewels, though they seemed to gleam now against skin that bore the faint lines of age. She still laughed, though her laughter was quieter, more measured, less like the challenge it had once been. Paris did not ignore her. Paris never ignores a figure of fascination, but it did not tremble at her presence as it once had. Clara Ward, once flame, was now ember, glowing still but in softer light, and yet she did not vanish. She continued to walk, to appear, to hold her place in the world's gaze. There was courage in this, perhaps even defiance, the refusal to retreat into obscurity, the insistence that she be remembered not as a story finished, but as a life still lived. She moved through the twilight of Paris as though each step was a reminder to the world that she had not bowed, not broken, not surrendered to shame. If she was now a ghost, she was a ghost of her own making, haunting society with the memory of its disapproval and her disregard for it. But twilight is not only gentle, it is also lonely. As the city darkened, as lamps flickered and the night deepened, Clara must have felt the solitude of her later years pressing more heavily upon her. Lovers had drifted, fortune had dwindled, beauty had softened, scandal had lost its sharpness. What remained was the echo of what had been, the endless memory of choices made long ago. Did she, in these hours, feel sorrow for what she had lost, or satisfaction that she had lived as she chose? Perhaps both at once, for Clara was never a woman of one emotion alone. Her life had always been a mixture of triumph and tragedy, joy and sorrow, freedom and exile. The Paris streets at twilight seemed to mirror her own condition. They glowed with beauty, with light reflected upon wet stone, yet they carried a melancholy that could not be denied. She walked past cafes where laughter spilled onto the pavement, but she did not enter. She passed salons where young beauties now drew the admiration once given to her, and she did not look back. She walked quietly, her presence still noticed, but no longer the center of attention. She had become a figure that people glanced at and whispered about, as one whispers of a memory that refuses to fade. The ghosts of her past followed her in these walks. She might have seen in her mind's eye the halls of Chimay, where her footsteps once echoed in restlessness, the cafes of Paris, where she once sat laughing beside Rigaud, the casinos of Monte Carlo, where the wheel spun in reflection of her life. Each place, each moment lingered like a specter, reminding her that she had been many women: heiress, princess, lover, scandal, spectacle. Now in her later years she was all of them at once, their shadows gathered around her as she moved through the city. Perhaps she found comfort in this haunting, for it meant that she had lived vividly, that she had left traces too strong to be erased. Or perhaps she found it heavy, a burden of memory that would not let her rest. The truth is uncertain, as it always was with Clara. She revealed much and concealed more, offering the world her image, but keeping her deepest thoughts for herself. Even now, as her light dimmed, she remained an enigma, a riddle no one could fully answer. The lamps of Paris glowed softly against the mist, their light diffusing into halos, and Clara's figure, walking through that mist, seemed part of the haze, neither entirely present nor entirely gone. She was still here, but already she belonged to memory. Already she was fading into the realm of legend. The world that once scorned her now softened, for time makes even scandal less sharp, transforming outrage into story, defiance into curiosity. Clara was now the ghost of her own legend, haunting Paris with her presence, haunting herself with her past. The door of a small house closed softly behind her as she returned from one of these twilight walks. The sound was quiet, final, carrying with it the sense of endings. Inside, the rooms were still, the air heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. Clara sat alone in the dim light, her eyes upon the shadows, her thoughts upon all that had passed. The softly closed door becomes the silence of another place, colder and more final. The echoing stillness of hospital halls where footsteps are hushed and the air smells faintly of medicine and resignation. The softly closed door of her Parisian home dissolved into another silence, a silence colder, sharper, lined with the faint medicinal scent that clung to the corridors of hospitals. Here the air was not filled with the murmur of cafes or the laughter of boulevards, but with the muted tread of nurses, the faint clink of instruments set upon trays, the whisper of linen as patients turned restlessly upon narrow beds. In this atmosphere of resignation and fragility, Clara Ward's later days unfolded, her once brilliant presence dimmed by illness, her restless energy slowed by the exhaustion of her body. It is not known exactly when her health began to fail, but the years of scandal and ceaseless motion had taken their toll. The late nights, the heavy perfumes, the constant strain of living in the gaze of others, all left their mark. Clara, who had once seemed inexhaustible, radiant with defiance, now felt the fatigue of decades pressing against her. Her beauty, though still visible, had softened, her eyes still luminous, but shadowed with weariness. Where once her gowns had startled with their daring, she now wore simpler garments, chosen less for scandal and more for comfort. And where once she had been surrounded by admirers and critics alike, she now found herself increasingly alone, her companions fewer, her gatherings smaller, her stage replaced by quiet halls, where illness rather than scandal dictated the rhythm of days. In these later years, Clara must have reflected often upon the life she had lived. The heiress of Detroit, the princess of Chimay, the scandal of Europe, the companion of musicians and wanderers, the performer upon stages both real and imagined. Her life had been a tapestry of extremes, woven with threads of brilliance and sorrow, passion and exile. Now, in the hospital silence, that tapestry seemed to hang before her as something both triumphant and tragic. Did she smile at the memory of her daring, or sigh at the cost it had exacted? Did she regret the choices that had brought her here, or did she remain unrepentant, as she had always seemed to be in the eyes of the world? The truth, as ever with Clara, remains elusive, for she revealed her story in fragments, leaving much to speculation and imagination. The nurses who tended to her must have seen not the legend, but the woman, an aging figure, frail, her body yielding to illness. They would not have known her as Europe had known her, nor as Detroit once remembered her. To them, she was another patient in need of care, another life at the edge of its end. Yet even here, one imagines that her presence could not be fully obscured. Perhaps she still carried herself with a hint of the elegance that had once unsettled courts and salons. Perhaps her eyes still held that brightness of defiance, even as her body grew weaker. For Clara had lived too long in visibility to surrender entirely to anonymity, even in decline. Illness is a great equalizer, stripping away titles, gowns, fortunes, and scandals alike. In the hospital silence, Clara Ward was no longer the princess who shocked Europe, nor the heiress of Detroit, nor the lover of violinists and wanderers. She was a woman, fragile, nearing the end of her days. Yet within her, the memory of those identities surely burned still, faint but persistent, like embers refusing to fade. For memory does not yield so easily, and Clara's life had been too vivid, too extraordinary to vanish quietly into forgetfulness, even within her own heart. Perhaps in moments of clarity she thought again of the places she had known, the halls of Chimay, the cafes of Paris, the casinos of Monte Carlo, the promenades of Italy, the streets of Detroit. Perhaps she remembered the faces of those she had loved, those she had lost, those who had judged her, those who had admired her. Each memory must have come as both comfort and burden, reminding her that she had lived with intensity, yet also that such intensity had left her weary. The hospital's quiet rhythm, nurses moving softly, doors opening and closing with care, voices hushed, was so far removed from the tumult of her earlier life that it must have seemed almost unreal. Clara, who had once lived in scandal's roar, now lay in silence. And yet there was perhaps a kind of peace in this, a final release from the endless gaze of the world. For in the hospital she was not spectacle, but simply herself, a woman at the end of her journey. She died in 1916, in Paris, the city that had been both her stage and her prison, The exact details of her passing are sparse, as though the world that had once feasted upon her every movement had grown tired and turned its gaze elsewhere. Her death did not command the headlines it once might have. She slipped away quietly, her scandal already softened into memory, her legend already half faded. And yet, for those who remembered, her passing marked the end of an era, the close of a story that had once shocked and fascinated Europe. Her burial, too, carried none of the grandeur of her youth. There were no grand ceremonies, no public displays. She was laid to rest with little of the spectacle that had defined her life, as though death itself sought to strip away the layers of scandal and leave behind only the truth of mortality. The woman who had once commanded the gaze of thousands was now carried silently to the earth, accompanied by only a few. The final breath she drew lingered for a moment and then was gone, dissolving into the still air of the hospital chamber. And in that dissolution the silence deepened, heavy and irrevocable. That last breath becomes another silence, but not of rooms or corridors. It becomes the echoing stillness of a church where bells toll softly and the murmur of prayer rises, carrying with it the memory of a woman who once unsettled the world with her defiance. The last breath dissolved into the silence of the hospital, and that silence grew until it seemed to fill the vaulted chambers of a church. Bells tolled faintly in the distance, their tones carrying across the rooftops of Paris, echoing not in triumph, but in solemnity. The sound was neither joyous nor sorrowful, but somewhere in between, a recognition of a life that had been lived in extremes, now brought to its quiet close. Inside, candles flickered, their flames rising and bowing with the stir of unseen draughts, while the air smelled faintly of incense, of wax, and of the cool stone that holds centuries of prayer. It was here, in such stillness, that Clara Ward's passing was marked, her scandalous life reduced at last to ritual, to murmur, to memory. Her death in 1916 did not command the roaring headlines that had once followed her every movement. The Europe that had gossiped endlessly about her had grown older, distracted by other dramas, consumed by the storms of war that raged across the continent. The world had changed, and Clara's scandal, once fresh, had long since hardened into legend, softened into curiosity, or been forgotten altogether by those who had newer names to whisper. And so her funeral was quiet, modest, attended by few, with none of the spectacle that had accompanied her life. She, who had once been pursued by crowds, was now accompanied only by a small circle of mourners. Her presence carried not in daring gowns or jewels, but in the stillness of a coffin. The priest's words rose into the air, intoned with the same solemnity given to any soul, whether heiress or pauper, princess or unknown. In death, Clara Ward was no longer the scandalous figure who had shocked courts and salons, nor the heiress whose fortune had made her irresistible to noble houses. She was simply a woman whose body had grown frail, whose breath had ceased, whose soul, if one believes such things, had departed into mystery. The prayers were the same as for all others, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition, their meaning less in their sound than in their endurance. A handful of earth was scattered upon her coffin, the grains striking softly like muted rain. That sound, so slight, carried with it a finality that applause never had. Applause could fade and return, could rise and fall with the turn of a moment, but the sound of earth upon wood carried no return. It was the end of performance, the end of spectacle, the end of scandal. Clara Ward, who had lived so visibly, so defiantly, was now hidden from the world, her body given to the earth, her story left to memory. What did those few who attended her burial think as the earth fell upon her coffin? Did they recall the brilliant heiress of Detroit, whose father's fortune had set her apart even as a child? Did they remember the princess of Chimay, radiant in her youth, adorned in silks, admired and envied? Did they recall the scandalous lover laughing in cafes beside a violinist, daring to abandon title and fortune for passion? Or did they think only of the quiet figure who now lay still before them, her brilliance extinguished, her notoriety at last silenced? It is likely that even in death she remained enigmatic. For Clara's life had never been simple, never reducible to one story or one judgment. She'd been many things to many people, admired, condemned, envied, pitied, celebrated, scorned. And now, in death, she was all of them, and none of them, her identity dissolved into the silence of the grave. The handful of earth that covered her coffin seemed to erase the divisions, to reduce scandal and beauty, fortune and notoriety, all to the same quiet dust. Yet memory does not vanish so easily. Even as her body was given to the earth, her legend remained. In the minds of those who had known her, or who had read of her, or who had whispered her name in smoky cafes, she continued to live as symbol and story. For scandal has its own kind of endurance. It lingers, it transforms, it becomes myth. Clara Ward, though gone, was not erased. Her name still carried the echo of defiance, the shimmer of gowns, the laughter of cafes, the daring of a woman who refused to bow. The bells tolled again, their sound drifting farther this time, thinner, more distant. The mourners departed, their footsteps fading into the quiet streets. The church grew still once more, the candles burning low, the air heavy with the weight of endings. Outside, the city continued as always. Carriages rolled, voices rose and fell, lamps glowed against the dusk. Life did not pause for Clara Ward. Her passing was marked, and then the world moved on. But in that handful of earth, in that quiet ceremony, in that tolling bell, there was a sense of something unresolved. For Clara's life had been a question from the beginning. Was she rebel or victim, daring or foolish, courageous or reckless? Death did not answer it. Death, if anything, deepened the question, leaving her story suspended, unfinished, haunting. The sound of earth striking wood lingered in memory, soft and insistent, unresolved. And in that sound was the promise of reflection, of legacy, of the strange endurance of scandal across time. The falling earth shifts and becomes memory itself, a soft haze in which Clara's life is reconsidered, her legacy weighed, her image reframed. From dust she passes into story, from scandal into symbol, from the silence of burial into the uncertain echo of legend. The sound of earth striking wood dissolved into memory, and memory itself became a soft haze, like mist rising from fields at dawn, concealing and revealing in equal measure. It is within this haze that Clara Ward's legacy must be sought, for her life, like the light of early morning, cannot be held in sharp detail. It drifts between brilliance and shadow, between admiration and scorn, between defiance and fragility. From heiress to princess, from scandal to performer, from beauty to decline, she left behind not a clear story but a labyrinth of questions, a legacy that lingers because it resists conclusion. To some, Clara remains a cautionary tale, the American heiress who squandered fortune and position, who abandoned duty for reckless passion, who lived too boldly and died too quietly. They see in her life the dangers of excess, of rebellion, of refusing to bow to custom. To others, she is remembered as a symbol of courage, a woman who dared to live for herself, who defied the rigid codes that bound her sex and class, who sought freedom at any cost. Between these two images lies the truth, yet the truth itself is elusive, shifting like the haze that surrounds her memory. Her beauty, once the marvel of Europe, is remembered now through faded photographs, images that capture only a fragment of her presence. They show a woman with luminous eyes, a proud carriage, an elegance that seems to hold within it both defiance and melancholy. But no photograph can capture the sound of her laughter in a Paris café, the shimmer of her gowns under gaslight, the murmur of scandal that followed her footsteps. These live only in memory, in the recollections of those who saw her, in the words of newspapers that condemned and celebrated her in the same breath. Her scandal, too, has softened with time. What once shocked courts and salons now seems less outrageous, more tragic, more human. To abandon a prince for love, to choose passion over duty, to live openly in defiance of expectation, such acts, in her own time, brought condemnation, but seen through the distance of history, they reveal a woman who refused to surrender her spirit, who sought to shape her life in an age that denied women such freedom. What was once scandal is now, in some eyes, bravery. What was once disgrace is now defiance. And yet Clara was no simple heroine. Her life was not a pure tale of rebellion, but one also of extravagance, of indulgence, of choices that brought both joy and suffering. She was neither martyr nor saint, but a woman of contradictions, generous and reckless, radiant and weary, courageous and self-destructive. It is in these contradictions that her legacy endures, for they make her real, human, a figure who cannot be reduced to either condemnation or celebration. Perhaps this is why her story still draws fascination. We are drawn not to perfection, but to complexity, not to clarity, but to mystery. Clara Ward remains mysterious, her life a series of scenes that resist resolution. A young heiress gazing across the Detroit River, a princess in a Belgian chateau, a lover laughing in Paris cafes, a performer upon smoky stages, a woman gazing into a mirror at dim candlelight, a patient in a hospital bed. Each scene tells something of her, but none tells all. Together they form a life both brilliant and tragic, both scandalous and admirable, both unforgettable and uncertain. Her legacy also speaks of the world in which she lived. The late 19th century was a time of rigid codes and shifting boundaries, a time when women of wealth were expected to be silent ornaments, when titles demanded obedience, when reputation was as fragile as glass. Clara's defiance revealed both the cruelty of those codes and the possibility of living beyond them. She exposed the hypocrisy of a society that condemned her while devouring her story, that scorned her choices while profiting from its fascination with them. In this, her life becomes a mirror not only of herself but of her time, reflecting both its constraints and its contradictions. And so, as memory gathers around her, questions linger. Was Clara Ward a victim of her own passions, or of a society that gave her no place to breathe? Was she a rebel who carved her own path, or a wanderer who lost her way in scandal? Was her life a triumph of defiance, or a tragedy of excess? The haze offers no clear answer, only the whisper of uncertainty. Yet perhaps it is in that uncertainty that her true legacy lies, for to live a life that cannot be neatly resolved, that resists final judgment, is to live a life that endures beyond its years. Clara Ward endures because she cannot be contained by one story, one image, one meaning. She endures because she was many things at once, and because she embraced the contradictions of her existence rather than fleeing them. The haze of memory softens further until only faint images remain, the shimmer of a gown, the laughter of a cafe, the toll of a church bell, the sound of a violin trembling in the night. These fragments drift together like notes of a melody, unresolved, fading into silence yet still echoing in the mind. And as they fade, they leave behind not a conclusion but a question, a soft chord unresolved, a final image of a woman who shocked, who dazzled, who suffered, who lived. And so the story ends as her life did, not with clarity, but with mystery. Clara Ward, the scandalous heiress, the runaway princess, the woman who refused to bow, passes into legend as a figure of fascination, of contradiction, of defiance. She remains in the twilight between history and memory, between admiration and scorn, between beauty and shadow. Her story is not finished. For it is told again each time her name is spoken, each time her image is recalled, each time someone wonders at the life she lived. The unresolved chord drifts into the night, neither bright nor dark, neither triumphant nor tragic, but something in between. It fades gently, leaving only silence, a silence filled with the lingering presence of a woman who dared to live as she pleased, and who remains, even now, impossible to forget.